Friends, welcome to Pune International Center's PIC Conversations program. Our guest today is retired Surgeon Commander of the Indian Navy, Dr. Uday Kulkarni, who will be speaking to us on his latest book on the Peshwas, The Extraordinary Epoch of Nanasaheb Peshwa. At the outset, I must say that this is an extraordinary work, Dr. Kulkarni.
Thank you.
This is Dr. Kulkarni's sixth book in the last 9 years on the Peshwas and Maratha history. And while he has been a doctor by profession, he has pursued his passion for history with enormous zest and seriousness. At the very first glance of this 500-page book, it is evident that this is a deeply and meticulously researched book and has been printed very beautifully by Sujit Patwardhan's Mudra printers. The conversation with Dr. Kulkarni will be conducted by Mr. Amit Paranjape, a multifaceted technology entrepreneur and a member of PIC's programs and membership committees. I would now like to say a few words about Pune International Center. This is one of India's most active policy research think tanks, with Dr. Raghunath Machelkar as president and Dr. Vijay Kelkar as vice president. A number of programs and initiatives security, social innovation, science and technology, environment and climate change, and governance and urbanization. Do visit our website, puneinternationalcenter.org, for more information on our activities, and do interact with us. You are welcome to ask questions to Dr. Kulkarni, which may please be posted in the chat box. I would like to welcome Dr. Kelkar, who is one of the panelists in this program. May I now hand over the proceedings to Mr. Paranjape.
Good evening, and thank you, Abhay. I hope you can all hear me okay. So once again, a warm welcome to everyone joining. We have a very big audience here, and I'm sure everyone is very keen to hear Dr. Kulkarni. So I'm not going to speak a whole lot, just 2-3 minutes, and then hand it over to Dr. Kulkarni for his presentation about the book. I'll just say that it's been a privilege to know Dr. Kulkarni. He's become a very good friend over the last 10 years. He's done some amazing work in Maratha history, as Abhay mentioned, over the last 10 years, starting with his first book that's very popular, Solstice at Panipat. And he's filling a very important gap in the way history is being presented or learned by some of the people, especially the younger generation. For a long time, we have been looking at Indian history as something that was 17th century Mughal Empire and then 19th century British, right? And many of the views on history have, I would say, ignored or simply just glossed over the 18th century history, where the Marathas were the peak power and the Maratha Empire stretched all the way from Atak to Katak, as is a popular expression, or all the way from the foothills of Himalayas to Kaveri. And this empire obviously lasted for a better part of the 18th century. And the peak period of this was around middle of 18th century. And that's something that Dr. Kulkarni's most current book, the one that we are going to talk about, is going to discuss. And it's a phenomenal piece of work. I finished reading it about a couple of weeks back. Even some of his earlier books were very detailed, but this goes a step further in terms of the amount of research, the amount of study tours that he did to various locations, and the amount of graphs and original documents, maps that he's looked at. So this is a great piece of work. I'll mention at the outset that this book is available on Amazon.in. Normally, if we had done this program in person, like some of the other PIC programs, we would have had this book for sale, but this is 2020, and we will have to go with online sales for the book as well. So I do urge all those who are interested to check out the book at Amazon.in after this presentation is over. I'll just make one last point, and this is something that came up when we had a great book launch event September 27th, 2 weeks back, at the hands of Yashodhara Rajeji Scindia and Professor Amit Paranjape. One of the discussions that all of us alluded to one way or the other is a new school of history being created by Dr. Kulkarni. I mean, he's very modest. He won't talk about it. But we have had a great tradition of history in Maharashtra, in Pune, or India. If you go back all the way back to Rajwade, Sardesai, and he's really carrying it forward. And the fact that he is publishing these books first in English is making sure that some of this work is being read by a much wider group of people all over India and even outside India. So I think this is really a fantastic effort, and we hope to hear in detail about the book, about this fascinating era of mid-18th century from Uday. What we'll do after Uday's presentation, which will be about 40-45 minutes, is I'll do a brief Q&A, ask some of the questions that are very commonly asked to Uday in these kind of presentations. And I'll just take 2 questions. And after that, I will moderate the questions that come through the chat box. So you can start now, but I would urge you to wait till Uday presents some of his thoughts and then start asking questions in the chat. And then I'll start taking some of those questions and we will do a Q&A. So with that, I think over to Uday.
Good evening, everybody. It's early evening. And thank you all for, and especially the PIC for an opportunity to speak about my book on the Epoch of Nanasaheb. This book is one of the 5 books about which move forward in a chronological manner through the 18th century. The 6th one was a translation of my first book on Panipat. And one might quite easily observe that basically these are books mostly about Maratha history. But I would rather say that this is pertaining more to the 18th century and not purely about Maratha history. The reason I say that is because there is hardly a province in India which did not involve the Marathas in the 18th century. And if you even try to write a regional history of, say, Bengal or the Karnataka or the Punjab or Delhi, you cannot write it without really knowing Maratha history. None of the books that I've written are biographies, though the era of Bajirao may have Bajirao's name and the extraordinary epoch of Nanasaheb Peshwa may have his name on it. They are books of a period. And the names of Bajirao and Nanasaheb are given to these books because they were the most predominant personalities at the helm of the largest power that appeared at that time, that was prevailing at that time in India. So this book, which we're going to talk about today, deals with a 25-year-long period, which begins in the mid 1730s and ends in 1761. It's a 25-year-long period which we're going to talk about. So I will just share my screen so that we'll be able to say what we are. Can you see it now or not yet? One second.
Yes, we can see it now, Dr. Kulkarni.
Okay. So I'll just make it full screen. That's it. So this is the person we're going to talk about. This is a picture which I got from the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj's Vastu Sangrahalaya in Bombay some years back, and of course to crop a lot of frame. It's a very big frame and a very small picture in the center. So this picture was probably drawn from an earlier picture in the mid 19th century at Satara, and that is where this picture is coming from. Now I remember when we go back when I was in school, for example, in the 1960s, there was a saying which many of us, my classmates, used to say. It is in Marathi that इतिहास करतो ऱ्हास, भूगोल देतो त्रास आणि गणित करतो सर्वांना नापास. So if you have to talk about the meaning, of course, in English, if I have to translate, is that history and geography trouble you, while maths, of course, fails you. So when you write a book, you have to keep in mind that history has to be interesting. At the same time, it has to be annotated non-fiction, simple, chronological, as far as the time of the period that you're discussing. So I try to keep that in mind. Again, there are very often people ask you, well, why should you write about history at all? And of course, the question is obvious. But I remember what the mountaineer George Mallory had once been asked about why he wanted to climb Everest. And he replied, because it's there. Well, so is history there. And but it's not the only reason. And there were other reasons that sent me down that path. So 18th century, looking at the 18th century, you'll find that whatever I have written about whatever I have read about the 18th century before I set out on this path was usually either underrepresented the contribution of the Marathas or misrepresented the contribution of the Marathas. And that angst was building inside me for a very long time, which finally found expression when I wrote my first book on the 250th anniversary of the Battle of Panipat. And the second reason why Maratha sources are misrepresented, I would say, is because uh, the sources are basically still in Marathi. They have hardly been translated. So people who are not able to read them and not able to access them, because most of them have been out of print for nearly 100 years, you just get a garbled account from a secondary account written by somebody else who has copied it from a third person and that kind of thing. So if you see the references from where they are taken, they are quite amusing sometimes. As an example, I'd like to quote this, which somebody sent it to me some time back. And the person was a retired professor of Delhi University in Persian. And he claimed that the Rajya Vyavahara Kosh, which was actually uh, initiated by Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, and Raghunath Pandit, Raghunath Hanumante was asked, who was a court poet, to compile a Sanskrit-Persian dictionary. Actually, it was a Persian-Arabic-Sanskrit dictionary, so that the contemporary words of Persian and Arabic, which had found their way into Marathi, should be replaced by Sanskrit words. And it was interpreted by this gentleman as a love of Shivaji Maharaj towards Persian. So that kind of interpretation is quite common, and which has to be avoided. That is why we have to make sure that the real story is passed on. Even today, we find that the word Peshwa, which is a Persian word, was actually not the official word used in the letters of the time, and it was actually a Pandit Pradhan, which is the correct word which is used in the letters of that time. Now, as we go through this tortuous and quite polarized period of the 18th century of Indian history, as a chronicler, I call myself a chronicler actually. It's doubly difficult to go through this thick fog of obfuscation written by so many people, so many secondary sources. Each has got his own axe to grind, even when you look at contemporary sources. And there is an English official who I mean, there are plenty of English officials who wrote our history. In fact, it was mandatory for them to write the history of wherever they were at that time. And then they would call the native pagans their customs. And then there was a Mughal court historian paid by the emperor who had to sing praises in honor of the king. And then there was the independent Mughal chronicler. One such example being the Siyara Mutakharin, who was considered to be a good authority on what happened at that time. But even that book I find is biased. For example, when he writes about Bengal, he's vehemently against whatever the Nawab Siraj-ud-Dawla did at that time. So there was people who were divided, and they had their own opinions and so on. Out of these, in this book particularly, I found this very informative book which was published in 1933 on Duplay, because very often you have found that you are starved of French sources, and the French were a very important part of Indian history, especially starting from the Carnatic, and Duplay played a very big part in that. So in his 12 years in the Carnatic, whatever letters he wrote, and it's a 900-page book, which was, as you can see, partial fulfillment of the requirements of degree of doctor for the Columbia University. So this one edition, one book, I managed to get from UK in a second-hand bookstore, and that I added to my sources, which I could add. I could get a ringside view of the way this nationalist a French officer or governor used to think. And of course, he was not above making the quick buck now and then whenever he could find a chance. Then there are again the very carefully preserved Clive correspondence documents, which are there in, I think they are in Wales as well as in the British Library. And these Clive boldly discusses the means of deceiving the enemy. A little bit of chicanery for him is not a big deal, as you can see from his letters. And of course, after 1739, with the loss of the northern part of Konkan, the Portuguese were relatively timid, and their letters were usually full of, what might have been, what they can do, but finally they really couldn't achieve much. Now the historian, while navigating his way through the Marathi sources, which there are thousands of published letters, which are gradually, falling apart because no reprints have come out. There are also millions of letters and documents just still lying in the archives, which have because they are in Modi, there are very few people who understand it. And if you understand Modi, you don't understand the historical context in which they are given. So a story of 75 years from the time that Chhatrapati Shivaji captured his first fort till 1818 when the Third Anglo-Maratha War was fought. If you can even try to estimate what might be the number of documents which Pune Municipal Corporation will generate, you'll understand in 170 years what kind of documentation must have been generated and how difficult it is to really go through them and try to get the real story of what happened, the motivations of people who were doing various things at that time. And what we are getting actually is a very filtered version, and only the prominent landmarks which we can navigate and the story which can be told with the help of these. So there is a lot more which is going to come out if proper finances and expertise is channeled in those sources. Of course, not being a very commercial venture, I don't know whether the government will ever spare time for it. So the historian eventually, after he navigates his path through all these sources, he has to be unbiased. He has to be apathetic. He cannot get involved with this subject, and he has to be more or less inert. These three are all negative attributes. I call them neti, 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 according to the famous aphorism used for Vedic analysis. Not this, not that, not this, that kind of thing. So, but eventually, if you keep these in mind, they help you to get to where the truth was, which is somewhere. Not, you're not entirely there, but most of the time you reach somewhere where the truth might be. With this preamble, or I would say even it could be a disclaimer, the writing of a book actually begins. And the miracle is that in the last few decades, what we see in India today is the growth of the great Indian middle class, and today 300 to 400 billion people are there. And these people are looking for something more than their physiological needs. I mean, food, clothing, shelter has already been taken care of. What they want now is something beyond that. It's like the Dil Mange More kind of situation. They want to know their past, they want to know about their culture, they want to emerge noble, and they want to emerge victorious when they read about their past. They want to shrug off their defeats and the symbols of their setbacks, and they want to embrace a history that they like, that they want to read. So this is, of course, a very tall order for anybody who sets off to write history, and especially one who likes to write his narratives as a war with warts and all. So this was the challenge that I faced when I began writing about this period of the 18th century. Now coming to the book, The Extraordinary Epoch of Nanasaheb Peshwa, the title itself I arrived at after some thought, because there's no point calling every book after book the era of somebody. Now, over the last 100 years, I found there have been only two books written about Nanasaheb Peshwa. One was written in 1926 by Govind Sakharam Sardesai Riyasatkar, and second, of course, was his own volume in the Riyasat series about Nanasaheb. Otherwise, there has been no dedicated book on Nanasaheb. Although this is not a biography, it's a story of his times. You find in the 1926 version, Riyasatkar Sardesai was generous enough to offer the writing of the preface of the book to the foremost detractor of the Peshwa, who was Trambak Sadashiv Shezwalkar. And Shezwalkar wrote a 38-page long preface to that book. And here, he practically wrote his own version of events. And he was severely critical of most things that Nanasaheb did in his 21-year tenure. And in fact, the publisher had to insert a separate note at the start of the book because Sardesai did not want to curtail that Prastavna. It was all published as it was. So the publisher added that the Shezwalkar was a little Nyayadhisha Pramane Nishthur, or he was stern like a judge. And he downplays this criticism of Shezwalkar by saying there are many prevailing circumstances beyond the control of any ruler which have to be considered before you pass judgment on that person. And in fact, this publisher even uses another dictum, where he says that Jache Hati Sasa To Pardhi. This, or whoever has the rabbit in his hand doesn't necessarily mean that he's the hunter. So this superficial reading of events cannot be sufficient to really translate the story of a person into a book. And On the other hand, publisher says that Sardesai looked upon the period with far greater empathy. I hope that in this book I've tried to fall somewhere between these two versions, neither going toward the empathy way nor being like the Nishthur Nyayadish and falling somewhere in between. In the midst of those 38 pages that Shezwalkar has written, one comes across a startling concession to the Peshwa, in which Shezwalkar says, जगाच्या इतिहासात जे क्रांतीचे काळ अनेक शतकाने एकदा येतात अशा एका काळाच्या दरवाजावर तो नानासाहेब पेशवा उभा होता. In other words, in the history of the world, a revolutionary period comes after several centuries. In India, such a time came in the mid 18th century, and Nanasaheb Peshwa was at the helm of affairs at the start of this epoch. So, in a way, he understands that this was a very unusual period, and this period was a period of great change that took place across the country. It was a time of change of guard. It was a time of change in the cultural milieu. It was a change in how the country was run, in how battles were fought. Therefore, the mid-18th century comes out as a perfect crossroad of Indian history. It was a time when Marathas spread all over the country, yet in corners where they had limited influence, the English managed to eke out a small foothold for themselves. In fact, looking at the history of Marathas, you find that they were a mild people. You don't hear whether it was the influence of their king Chhatrapati Shahu or because they were originally tillers of the land who wielded a weapon in their own defense. They were not a cruel people, and Chhatrapati Shahu himself abjured cruelty, embraced forgiveness, generosity. So that was a trait which you find in Maratha armies that go around the country. In spite of this label that they were looters and they went to various places and the places over there, for which there were several reasons which these things took place. And for example, in the time of Baji Rao, you find that the Nizam-ul-Mulk was twice let off in spite of having been completely defeated. When Baji Rao attacked Delhi, the suburbs of Delhi were not burnt because he said it is a Mahapuri, and burning the suburbs would break the cord of diplomacy. The defeated Portuguese were allowed to leave the fort of Vasai with their families and with the band playing martial music, and they were even given ships to go back to their to go Bombay and then to Goa. So one will not find the cruelty of, say, a Nadir Shah or an Ahmad Shah Abdali in any Maratha campaign, even by the standards of medieval times. In this period, another very phenomenal change took place from the period of Baji Rao. Now, in the period of Baji Rao, in fact, a great historian like Yadunath Sarkar says that Baji Rao was the creator of a greater Maharashtra. In that, he means that the influence of Maharashtra spread up to the river Chambal and the Yamuna in the north, the Tungabhadra in the south. And therefore, this lasted almost till 1947 because we had the Scindias, the Holkars, the Gaikwads who were in these areas. And until 1947, the Maratha influence was pronounced right up to Gwalior in the north. So this greater Maharashtra was created by Baji Rao. And in the end, you find that at the time of Baji Rao's death, this was the area which the Marathas controlled. But after 1740, you find there is a change. And the Nanasaheb's time, the Marathas spilled over beyond these boundaries. And they crossed the Yamuna, and they crossed the Chambal, and they went across the Kaveri to help the Hindu kings of Trichinopoly and Tanjavur who were attacked by the Nawab of Arcot. And in 1740, the province of Bengal was usurped by Alivardi Khan from the dynasty of Murshid Quli Khan. And there was an invitation from an opposite party. Raghuji Bhosle went, and for next 10 years, there was a battle in Bengal to get the chowth of that place. And once the chowth was promised in 1751, for the next 5 years, you find that Bengal was at peace. And at least until 1756, if not later, there are records of the chowth being paid of 12 lakh rupees being paid annually to the Nagpurkar Bhosles. So because of this spilling over beyond what was the greater Maharashtra, what remained as the greater Maharashtra later on, the territories that they now entered, which were Rajputana, the Ganga Jamna, Doab, or Delhi, these were the territories which there were increased, skirmishes between the local Pas. And in the south, especially in the Carnatic, you find that the European rivalry was carried forward from Europe into India, and that is what also contributed towards the history of that period. So that the old problem with the Nizam of Hyderabad had not been entirely extinguished to 1740, and soon enough you find that the Nizam is propped up by the French. So into all these problems that were taking place around that time, you find the French under Dupleix, and then the English, who first began defensively, but with the innate cunning of the trader, I call it, they stole a march over the French. And to the extent that there are documents which show that the governor at Madras, at Fort St. George, actually tried to influence through the Secretary of State in London that the French king recalls Dupleix from Pondicherry, because without recalling Dupleix, it would be very difficult for the English to get their way in the Carnatic. So all these problems were happening at the same time during this time. Now, into this, when the English and the French came in, the first ambition of securing a kingdom for itself was Dupleix. And it was the first small European power comprising just a few hundred soldiers who chased off the army of the Nawab of Arcot in the Battle of Adyar in 1746, which gave the Europeans sudden vision that with their techniques and their rapidly firing and reloading guns, they could take on an Oriental army, and they could make their mark, and they could take over the province. They could rule by proxy, keeping the Nawab in name only, and that's what they started to do, beginning in the Carnatic. So it was started by Dupleix, and it was taken forward by Robert Clive, and that's what you see over here. However, there's one more thing which is often missed out, and we always credit the East India Company for having established a British rule in India, which is not the case, because you find in 1754-55 a large Royal Navy Armada, which is one of the most powerful ever to visit the shores of India. The description of those ships which came here, 60, 70 guns in each of them, very disciplined sailors. In fact, the British Navy at that time was probably the most powerful navy in the world. And 7 or 8 of those ships came under Vice Admiral Charles Watson to India. And if you see in the slide, you'll see a representation of Charles Watson dressed in a Roman commander. And on one side, on the left-hand side, you find Calcutta, which was freed in January 1757. And on the right, you find the triumph of the English Navy at Vijayadurg, and one of the natives of Vijayadurg have been captured and tied up there. And on the pillar, you find another plaque which shows how he has captured Chandarnagar, the French capital in Bengal. So these 3 chief achievements of the East India Company were not carried on on their own, but it was because for 5 years, the Royal Navy, led by this man, and after his death by his assistant, Admiral Pocock, they stayed in India and they've won all these battles. In fact, at one place you find Admiral Watson writing to Siraj-ud-Dawla that it's all very well for you to agree to my terms just now, but when I'm no longer here, what will happen? So to eliminate that fear, they decided that they will even get rid of the young Nawab and have their own puppet in that place. And this picture, of course, shows Mir Jafar meeting Robert Clive after the Battle of Plassey. It was around this time in 1757 that Ahmad Shah Abdali came to India on his 4th invasion. And probably it was the most brutal invasion that India faced, because he did not stop by entirely looting Delhi and massacring a lot of people there, but he went south to Mathura and Vrindavan, where he waged what can only be called a religious war. And the waters of the Yamuna ran red because so many days the massacres were going on. It was only an attack of cholera in his camp that made him withdraw to Delhi. And the amount of loot he took from Delhi in 1757 was so much that he had to kind of procure all the animals in that city, right from elephants, camels, horses to the washerman's donkey. They were all laden with all the goods that he could find and taken back along with him to Kabul. Sure enough, a few months after that, the Marathas, who were actually by that time, they were the protectors of the Mughal emperor. They had been involved in the succession disputes in Rajputana before that in Jaipur and Jodhpur. They had also been to Delhi before, where they had changed emperors and wazirs. And when Abdali, and they had promised the emperor that they will protect him from all his internal and external enemies. All these things happened within a dozen years of Nanasaheb coming into power. That's in 1752. And when Abdali came and attacked in this manner, a very small Maratha army was there. Some parts of it were in Delhi, parts of it were in Indore, parts of it were at Jaipur. And by the time they assembled an army after their harvest season was over and they got together and marched to Delhi, Abdali was already on his way back, but he had left his son and his general in Lahore to look after the Punjab. 1757, you find the Marathas taking over Delhi from Abdali's protege, Najib Khan. They enter the Punjab, they take Lahore. Najib Khan and Taimur Shah Abdali cross the river Ravi and flee towards Attock, Peshawar and Kabul. And the Marathas actually sent their people, their officers, not only do they take Lahore, but Attock, Multan and Peshawar, three principal cities in that region, were also having Maratha officials in charge of those places. And this situation lasted not for 1 or 2 months, it was there for a full 18 months. And along with them, there had some local Mughal officials who were kind of instrumental in doing the day-to-day administration. So you find suddenly that the Maratha Empire, within 18 years of Nanasaheb's becoming the Peshwa, has reached right up to the Khyber Pass, and in the south it has reached Trichinopalli. On the west, it is already in Gujarat, as the Maratha ditch which was built at Calcutta in Bengal. Odisha has been taken over, and practically they are the masters of all of India. Indeed, if you look at it at this stage, 1758, there was not a single power that could challenge Nanasaheb. In fact, in 1758, in September, Raghunath Rao, who had led the campaign to Lahore, wrote a letter to the Peshwa saying that there is an offer which has come to me from the king of Persia, saying that we can both attack from either side and destroy Abdali in Afghanistan, and you take Kabul and I will take Kandahar, to which Raghunath Rao writes to the Peshwa that Kabul and Kandahar have been parts of the Mughal Empire and parts of India till 100 years ago. And I don't see any reason why we should share them with the ruler of Iran. So this was the kind of confidence that existed in 1758, 1759, when the Marathas actually reached that stage. And who could have ever imagined that something could go wrong from here? Well, you know what happened after that, but I'm not going to give the story beyond this. I think you'll have to read the book because it's all described in greater details over there. For the present, I will show you these two maps which have been drawn by some English geographers. One which shows India at the time of Clive, and that huge yellow portion which you see is the part of the Maratha kingdom which goes right up to the river Satluj. And if you look at India's map today, there are several hundred kilometers of Indian border with Pakistan which runs along this river. Whether it has got a bearing on the India of today, I leave it to you to decide, but you can have a look at the map. The second map is of India in 1795, where you find it has made further inroads into the Nizam's territory after the Battle of Kharda. And up to 1795, had there not been internal dissensions and other unfortunate events that took place, like the sudden death of the Peshwa and so on, who knows what could have happened in the days to come. So this is what actually happened. And you find that the British actually captured their Indian empire from the Marathas. And that is why they were always wary of anything that the Marathas might do. Nearly 80 years after the Battle of Khadki and the Battle of Koregaon and the Battle of Ashti and the last Peshwa's surrender to John Malcolm, in Pune, there was the assassination of by the Chafekars of the plague commissioner, Rand. And by way of explanation, I never tire of quoting this. There was an English author named Stevens who says that he analyzes that why is it that the Marathas are so opposed to the British rule? And why is it that they are constantly fighting with us? Why is it that all the revolutionary activities are centered here? Why is there a Lokmanya Tilak here? Why is there a Gokhale here? So in 1899, he wrote a remarkable paragraph in his book, which he says the other provinces of India were ceded to us or conquered from alien lords. The Marathas lost their all in war. The Marathas have never forgotten how high they were less than 100 years ago and who it was that brought them low. They lost more than others did, and they feel the loss more. For others, we were a change of masters. Them we brought down from masters to slaves. His empire, his nationality, his religion, his honor, his beautiful language, we have taken away his all. So if you look at the situation in 1899, the British knew that the Marathas were the main people from whom they took. The British chroniclers and historians, almost I would say purposefully, when they wrote their histories, they downplayed the Maratha role in the history of India. And therefore, you find that in the 18th century is often described as a time which in 1757, the Battle of Plassey took place and the Mughal empire was finished and the British Empire started. But there was a century of Maratha rule in between. And it is that period which we have to study and we have to present with whatever documentation we have so that we can present the story in its correct format and not be taken away by secondary sources, by people who wrote because they had a vested interest in presenting the history the way they did. So there's another thing I would like to point out, and that is it was not easy for any one emperor to really capture all of India at one time. In the entire history of India, you'll find that this has happened probably only 3 or 4 times, starting from Ashok, who probably captured most of India, probably Alauddin Khilji captured about at least 70% of it, and then Aurangzeb in the last 20 years of the 17th century, early 18th century, when his empire reached right up to the Kaveri. But none of them were able to hold it for a long enough period. And similarly, the Marathas were there from Peshawar to the Kaveri and Gujarat to the Bengal. But it was very difficult to hold this huge, vast country with the primitive communications that you had at that time under one single emperor. And I would even go to the extent of saying that is why we have this concept of a Chakravarti Raja and a federal kind of a system, which we have always been and we have always inherited. So that is probably what India was. And it continues to be in the same state today. So what is more important about the 18th century, I feel, is that after centuries of being subjugated by alien powers, and I say alien powers with all the responsibility I can summon, because a power which has got foreign language as their court language, they have a state religion, and they have a system by which you're promoted to higher posts in the government if you have a Persian or a Turkey ancestry, cannot be called an indigenous government. So it was after several centuries that an indigenous state rose in India, and it was probably the first indigenous empire after many centuries. At the same time, it was the last indigenous empire before the British took over. And had this very important 150-year period not happened in our history, we would have had a succession of foreign rulers over us for the last 1,000 years. And that would have been something which I'm sure none of the people today from the growing middle class would have looked back upon with any kind of pride, and would not have really taken to reading the history that we write today. Nanasaheb was, of course, a great letter writer, and his epoch, in addition to being expanding Maratha empire, he was a great letter writer. And if you want to really understand Nanasaheb, you have to go to his letters. And very early in his reign, when he went to the north and he went to Bundelkhand, he written a very long letter to his friend Nana Purandare. And it's very difficult to translate it. In fact, I'm surprised that letter is not put up in one of the syllabus for for Marathi or some in the BA or the MA level. But I just got a small paragraph here which I will have put up here, where he says, the gardens and flowers and the lotuses in the north one cannot count. Seeing their bright appearance, one feels one should pray that they come to our own country. However, perceiving our land to be alien to theirs, even after our prayers, they do not agree to come. So this was the kind of a person you're actually dealing with here, who is very subtle, who has a very strategic vision about what he wants, whose mind was very difficult to guess, who could be very mild and benevolent to his friends. At the same time, he could be very stern and to his enemies, and would probably be a very difficult person to have as an enemy. There are many parts, vignettes, I would say, in this period that I have discussed, and for that I have created a separate entity called the Vakyanavis. The Vakyanavis again comes from the Persian, but roughly translated, it means the remembrancer, or remembers the events that happened of that time. And it discusses various things. It discusses about Pune, about the Kashi Yatra, the rivers of gold, or the Suvarna Nadi of the north and the south, which Nanasaheb wanted to bring to Pune. It discusses the number 18, which is often mentioned colloquially in the Marathi language, various policies, orders, and judgments which were passed during his reign. It discusses the Maratha cavalry. So all these things are coming intermittently in the book as a kind of glimpse into what kind of life the people were living, what kind of administration they were facing, and it will give you a little more insight than just a narrative of the times. That's what I hope to achieve. And finally, Nanasaheb would have been a very good poker player, because in the words of a very famous song of that time, he knew when to hold them, he knew when to fold them, he knew when to walk away, and he knew when to run. So it was very difficult to guess what is in his mind. And though the first 10 years of his reign, he was the prime minister, in the second 10 or 11 years, he was practically the ruler of the Maratha Empire. And a ruler has to be a good player at poker. And Nanasaheb, I'm sure, would have been very good at it. I'll sum up by saying that the 18th century was when it was all happening in India. With the instruments at his disposal and the strategic vision that he had, Nanasaheb handled all the problems that he faced as best as he could. I would place Nanasaheb as an 18th century ruler who faced the greatest challenges of all. How he faced them and whether he succeeded is, I would leave to the readers to decide. Without being general, the mold of, say, Bajirao or Sadashirao Bhau, or even his son Madhavrao, Nanasaheb could win a battle with the flourish of a pen. And his letters are the best means of assessing him. And his moves, he had spies in high places. For example, the Nizam had at least 3 ministers who were friendly with Nanasaheb and who could pass on information to him from the court of the Nizam. He charmed the British, the French general Bussy, who after the first battle in Bhalki, he never went, the next 7 years that he happened to be with the Nizam, he never went Nanasaheb's way again and tried his best to win him over. You'll be surprised to learn in this book that Robert Clive, because the English were allies at that point in time, when he went to Calcutta and before the Battle of Plassey, Nanasaheb sent him a letter saying that should you so desire, I will send an army of 70,000 men into Bengal to help you recapture the land and depose the Nawab over there. The reason for this is that Nanasaheb had wanted Bengal for himself for a very long time. And with 70,000 soldiers over there, definitely Clive could not have had his way. And you'll be surprised that 2 days before the Battle of Plassey, Clive writes a letter from very close to Plassey, where his camp was, to the governor in Calcutta, saying that should I go ahead with the battle or should I call the Marathas for help? So these are all documented letters. So this is what history would have been and could have been. So this epoch is extraordinary, hence the title of the book. And in that time, because Nanasaheb was the biggest player of that period, it was the extraordinary epoch of Nanasaheb. I will just end by rephrasing a paragraph which is used by Charles Dickens, and I will use it in a different way. Charles Dickens had started a book by these words: "It was the best of times, it's the worst of times." I have carried on further saying it was a time of betrayal, it was the age of cruelty and the age of chicanery. It was the season of change, it was an epoch of conquest, it was a spring of freedom. It was a dusk of bondage, it was the high noon of nationalism. And during this period, it was Nanasaheb presiding over it all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kulkarni. This was really amazing. I think you've done great justice to, I won't call it a summary of the book because it would be impossible to summarize such a detailed 200,000 word book. But I think you have highlighted enough about the key aspects of that period, the key aspects of Nanasaheb, and the key aspects of what else was going on in India around that time. And it's just an absolutely fascinating time and something that many are not aware of. I myself, having studied a bit of history, even I wasn't aware of the role of the French, for example. We always study about Plassey, we study about Clive, we study about English. But after reading your book in detail, I finally realized how big the French were. And if not for one or two wars, they might have been the dominant power and not the English. Just as an example. So we have a few questions coming up, and I would request all the listeners to post questions in the chat box. I'm also checking my Twitter, so anyone who is looking at the live feed on YouTube, they can send me a reply on Twitter. I'll try to take some of those questions there as well. But in the meantime, I'm going to start with 2 or 3 overview questions that are often asked to Dr. Kulkarni, right? So one question and one topic, and that's especially important given that we are here in Pune and the Pune International Center here, and you have an entire chapter on that, right? Very few people, even here in Pune, realize what Nanasaheb did for Pune. You yourself have called him the architect of Pune. I've written a few times that, what was a small town became a real big capital city among the top 5 cities in the country. So can you briefly talk about Nanasaheb's contribution to the city of Pune in terms of various civic amenities as well? Uday, you're on mute.
Okay, this is a story I've narrated here that how in 1745 there was a famine and there was no water available for people living in the city. And her very powerful chiefs who wanted water for their gardens and to take the water from the river, and therefore water was falling short, drinking water was falling short. So Radhabai, who was Nanasaheb's grandmother actually, so she was in Pune at that time, and she wrote to Bajirao that this cannot go on. When people are not getting water to drink, you can't be supplying water to the gardens of powerful chiefs who are sitting in Pune. And Nanasaheb took this to heart, and he began this project of water supply for Pune, which started by building the 2 lakes of near Katharaj today, which are still extant, and from there underground tunnels with brickwork, which are still standing with periodic uchhas, it's called, where you can have manholes for people to go in and clean the channels. The water was brought up to the city, and all the main pates of the city, the water was opened into public houses or public tanks, including one which was brought right into the Shanwarwada. You can imagine a distance of almost 13, 14, 15 kilometers from Katharaj Lake to the Shanwarwada. And the entire pipeline was laid in an underground manner, and till early 20th century that the water was being supplied to all these public houses, some of which are still standing in old pates of Pune. So that was probably one of his very major projects that he did. But Nanasaheb, having gone to the north and the south and having seen the capital cities, he went to Delhi also. Having seen the capital cities of the various provinces, he wanted to make Pune a capital city. He loved the city of Pune. So whether it was gardens, whether it was various kind of buildings, whether it was lakes like the Saras Lake, which today has been emptied out by the British in the British era, all these places were created, and Pune was a zoo was made at that time. So these were the places which all created during Nanasaheb's time. The Parvati temples were built during his time. So here was a man, the first bridge of Pune, the Lakdi Pul. In the last month of his life, Nanasaheb built the Lakdi Pul. So you can see a person has a vision for the way the city has to be built and the way it has to expand. And he gave a lot of time, lot of his vision for the city towards developing the city into a capital city. Unfortunately, the time available to create that kind of an infrastructure and to really make it into a big capital city was not sufficient. But Pune was probably having a population of more than 200,000 people at that time, which is quite a bit by the standards of the 18th century.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. The pates that we look at today, the water supply, many of the gardens, Hirabag, for example, and I think so many of these were built during Nanasaheb's time, right? The other, and I'm going to group some of the questions together. There are the usual questions whenever we talk about history, and those are, what could have happened or what would have happened. And, there's no real good answer to that. But I'm combining a few questions here, but what were some of the reasons why the Marathas, towards the end of the 1950s, even when Nanasaheb was around, were not able to completely confront the British? And I think you partially answered that. They were probably not looking at them as enemies. They were probably more friends at that time. The other related question to that, which you have alluded to in, I think, the last chapter of your book, and that is, one of those what ifs, which is Nanasaheb dying immediately after Panipat was also a much bigger loss than Panipat itself. And can you expand on that and the Maratha-British alliance and how that was progressing post-1760, if you will, assuming Panipat still happened?
Actually, the Maratha-British alliance happened in 1739 for the first time. Because when the Marathas took the island of Salsette from Sashti, from the Portuguese, the British found the Marathas are the next door neighbors. Only the Mahim ki Khadi, which you have today, separating the Bandra from Mahim. So they sent an embassy to Pune and they extended the hand of friendship. And since they were not really interfering with the lives of the local people and they were not causing any trouble to the Marathas did not want to displace them. Though the English were scared that just as the Portuguese were evicted, they will also be evicted. But Bajirao had no such intention because they were useful for trade. All the products which manufactured in the hinterland were exported through the traders in Bombay. And they were not causing any harm. In fact, they were being a portal for goods to go abroad. So from that point of view, there was never any threat. And from that point onwards, in fact, there's a letter by Chhatrapati Shahu to both Chimaji Appa and Bajirao ki Ingraz far nishtepurvak vaktat. 10 years later, you find a Nizam Mulk saying the same thing to his children, that the English are the most reliable and they are true to their word. So, and they were never created any kind of invasive activities against the Maratha territories. 1754-55, for reasons which I have discussed in the book, the Peshwa and the English came to an alliance against one of the refractory nobles, the Sarkhel at Vijayadurg. And the Marathas went by land, took over the territory. The English went by sea with a huge Royal Navy armada which came down here. At that point in time, Turaji Angre was negotiating with the Maratha chiefs deal, kind of a peace deal. But the English had come prepared to not only capture Vijayadurg, but to take the loot from there and share it among themselves. In fact, 10 days before they attacked Vijayadurg, they had a meeting in which they even discussed that how the loot from Vijayadurg will be shared between the people who are there on the various ships. How much share will Watson get, how much will Clive get, and so on. This document is available. So they had already come with predetermined ideas, and when Watson found that Turaji is not being surrendered to them directly, they decided that if I don't get possession of this person by 1 o'clock, they broke the agreement and they attacked Vijayadurg. Nanasaheb was away on a campaign at Savnur at that time. And one of his officers, Ramaji Mahadev, was actually dealing with the situation in the Konkan. When he came back to Pune, he set about the very next day getting Vijayadurg back, and within a month, the British had to hand it over back to them. A strong fort like Vijayadurg, they were not willing to hand over, but they were forced to hand over just by the prestige of the Peshwa and the Maratha power. After that, the alliance kind of continued because when few months after that, the city of Calcutta was captured from the English. They were thrown out of Bengal, and probably they were at their lowest point ever in India. So they had lost their entire hold in Bengal at that time. And the battle at Karnataka was not yet won against the French. At that point in time, again, Nanasaheb offered his help to them. And this alliance kind of meandered on until finally, when the battle went on for Surat, where again they went as allies, but the English went and captured the Surat castle and the city and refused to share it with the Marathas. So 1759 was the first time that this trust was kind of breached in a way. And soon after that, the campaign for Panipat, the campaign against the Nizam, which ended up at Udgir, took place. So there was not sufficient time to tackle the problem which had occurred at Surat. Those two things happened in the same year. And after Panipat, you find that until Nanasaheb was alive, the territories which were belonging to the Marathas, including Etawah, which was beyond the in the Doab, beyond the Yamuna, was still in Maratha hands. It was as if the presence of the Peshwa was sufficient to keep the enemies at bay. Ahmad Shah Abdali sends an elephant, robes of honor, and pleads with his Vakil that he sign a treaty with the Peshwa. Even after he has reached Kabul, he sends letters back to his Vakil. Have you signed a treaty with the Peshwa? Which was finally signed much later. So this kind of prestige of the Peshwa lasted till he was alive. After his death, there was a sudden vacuum at the center for some time. And that is when you find from the south, Hyder Ali, who had come into prominence, began his attacks on the Maratha territory. The Nizam, who had until then been suppressed, began his attacks. Madhav Singh of Jaipur began his attacks in the north. And from all four sides, all those who had so far been subjugated, all rose up against the Maratha state. And the next 2 or 3 years of Madhav Rao's period, you'll find that he's actually facing all these problems on all four sides. Of course, that's not in this book, it's the next one. So that was the situation you find in the closing years of Nanasaheb's reign. And he lost almost 30 kg weight over a period of 1 year, which will show the degree of his illness and why he was unable to go on a campaign to Panipat. Because his diplomacy was such that had he gone to Panipat, the outcome could have been different. And his stature was such that it could have been different.
Yeah, I think that's all those what ifs are something that long discussions can be had. But a related question to that, and I think, and I would again strongly urge everyone to read this book in detail. But Nanasaheb has always been portrayed, even amongst very strong supporters of the Maratha history, the Marathas, the Peshwas. Nanasaheb has often, I won't call cast as a villain, but sometimes cast as someone who didn't really help the cause, right? When in fact, if you look at the data, he actually expanded something that his father Bajirao had created many, many folds, right? But the things that keep coming back are he didn't go to Panipat, the Angre campaign that you talked about, that is often highlighted as a big negative on his part. And I think you have described it extremely well, the circumstances, the different players, the scenarios out there. And I think everyone should read that in detail and draw their own conclusion. I think ultimately, it's not something that one can sort of push an idea down. I think it's and that's what you have done beautifully in all your other books as well, which is provide as much data as possible to the reader and then let them. Another question that has just come up is, and you talked about the federal structure where, there was a central power in Pune, but you had this distributed structure all over India. It had its strengths, but was that one of the reasons why some of the losses happened? Because the federal structure was not strong enough, where the center couldn't really assert the kind of control over some of these regional power centers, if you will.
When the Chhatrapati became weak, the responsibility of administration fell on the Peshwa. You'll find 20 years later, when the Peshwa became weak, it fell into the hands of the ministers. So the main advantage of Chhatrapati Shahu's presence as the king was that disputes with the other chiefs could be resolved. The Peshwa could give his orders on behalf of the Chhatrapati to the chiefs who obeyed them. The removal of Chhatrapati Shahu, because he died, and an absence of a suitable or adequate successor, for reasons again which I've gone into in several chapters in the book, suddenly found that the only person at that time who could really take the fortunes of or really manage the affairs of the Marathas at that time was Nanasaheb. And of course, as a politician, he desired that role. And as a fait accompli, it came to him. So it just happened that he became the de facto ruler of the Maratha state after 1750. Though there were a few rebellions and few people did not agree, like Damaji Gaikwad came charging down towards Pune and Satara. Suraji Angre did not accept his authority. So some of these people continued to rebel against him, and they had to kind of counter these threats. But ultimately, what used to happen, like his famous letter about the Suvarna Nadi from the north and the south, he describes that when the revenue is collected by the various chiefs in the north, the revenue does not come down to the capital of the Marathas, which was Pune. He says that on the way, the land is very arid, and the water from these two rivers of gold, it kind of seeps into the soil and does not reach where it should, which is the main capital of Pune. So that letter tells you a lot about why it was difficult to govern a far-flung kingdom sitting at one place, even though you had your own officers with each of the chiefs. It was not possible. There were local constraints sometimes. Sometimes the chiefs had their own expenses. Sometimes they just didn't want to give the money to the Peshwa in Pune. And they tried to find some means. That is, human nature doesn't change because it was the 18th century. So those kind of things were happening. And as the empire expanded, it became even more and more difficult to control it. The confederacy, which was created initially, that each person was given areas to conquer, helped in the rapid spread of the empire. And after it had rapidly spread, it became equally difficult to control it. Because the Marathas, as I said, were a mild people. They did not kind of brutally treat their governors, or if somebody didn't obey them, some local king, they did not kill them. They came back with another army 2 years later to again kind of punish him. So there's a lack of ruthlessness, or that streak of ruthlessness which a ruler probably would make things easier for him, which was not there at that time.
One of the things that you have discussed in the book, but that comes up, there are some related questions to that as well, is the administration systems that were set up by Nanasaheb and which continued in the second half of the 18th century during the Maratha Empire. So would like to hear briefly from you about that. And related to that, where some of the changes that were inspired by what they saw with the French and with the British armies, how that, starting with Sadashivrao Bhau, then later on Mahatma Shinde as well, how some of the army changes or the battlefield changes were also influenced. So both the administration of the revenue as well and land, as well as administration of the army, how were some of the changes that started happening during that period?
During the period of Bajirao, it was a period of rapid expansion, and that rapid expansion often did not allow the Peshwa to really put administration in its place. And I think your camera has moved, and allow the administrative people to go in their various places. On the other hand, in Nanasaheb's period, it was more of a settled administration, and he had the time to really streamline it. And not only Nanasaheb, but later on, after 1746, 1750, you find Sadashivrao Bhau playing a very big role. He was officially the Diwan of Nanasaheb, just like Chimaji Appa was the Diwan in Nanasaheb in Bajirao's time. The Bajirao was on the campaigns, but the most of the administration was looked after by Chimaji. So here, the administration was primarily looked after by Sadashivrao Bhau. And you find many English letters at that time also describing that most of the matters will be referred by Nanasaheb to Sadoba. Sadoba was Sadashivrao Bhau. In fact, it was Sadoba on one side and Raghoba on the other side, who were the two people who were helping him at that stage. So that was, and of course, there were officers, the Phadnis was there in every office who used to take accounts of the chiefs. Like just before Panipat, there were two chiefs whom I will not name, who were considered to have cheated them on revenue. And they were summoned back to Pune, and they would have been punished actually, had the battle of the Panipat campaign not come along, because of which they had to go back with the army to the north. So they did take harsh steps against people who did not accept what they had to say. But it was not always possible to enforce the way that things had to happen. About a change in the army, it was the French victory at Adyar over a much larger army using the rapid, and it said that the rate at which they were firing and reloading was far more than what the Mughal cavalry expected. And so when they went charging, and they were surprised to find that before they could reach the guns, they were already reloaded and they were firing back at them. So the era of artillery had begun. And these are the changes which took place in the way of battle that were seen by Nanasaheb as well as Sadashiro Bhau. When Bussy fought with Nanasaheb in 1751, the Nizam's army reached 8 miles from Pune. And it was only guerrilla tactics and, like scorched earth policy, what is called today, that you just burn the territory, deny them food and fodder, which kind of pushed the Nizam back from that point. So the efficiency of the guns, the French guns, was seen not only in 1751 here, but even 1755-56 when Nanasaheb himself was attacking the Nawab of Sawnur, because at Sawnur, Muzaffar Khan Gardi, who was a disciple of Bussy, was defending the Sawnur city with his guns, and Nanasaheb had to call Bussy for help with his guns. Before that, Nanasaheb tried the conventional methods of enforcing a siege and kind of trying to squeeze them off their supplies, which takes a long time. But immediately Bussy reached there, within a matter of days, he could blast the defenses of the fort. So these changes were noticed by them, and there were efforts made to, build your own guns was one part of the story, but they needed experts who could handle them. So first they tried to recruit Muzaffar Khan Gardi, but he was found to be traitorous and not reliable. Nanasaheb even tried to recruit Bussy at one stage. Finally, he recruited Ibrahim Khan Gardi. In fact, there's a letter which is an unpublished letter which I put in the book, where in 1757, when the Sindhkhed campaign was going on, Nanasaheb wrote to Dattaji Shinde, who was the hero of that battle, that tried to recruit Ibrahim Khan Gardi, give him so much pay, and see if he'll join over to the Maratha side. So that kind of efforts were going on. Now, the criticism is that why didn't they train their own people? In the 21st century, we are still buying weapons from abroad. So let us not pass judgment on what happened in the 18th century for people who are basically farmers. So, criticism should be justified and should be balanced.
Right. But I think just to add, I think with the recruiting of Ibrahim Khan Gardi and later on in the post Nanasaheb era as well, what Maharji Shinde did, I think by the time of the third or even the second Anglo-Maratha war, I think the artillery differentiation was not there. I think all sides were sort of equally armed, whether with imports or mercenaries or...
Yeah. Actually, Maharji Shinde realized the use of artillery, and he recruited De Boyne, of course, who was a Frenchman who came and he established his brigades, and he devised the entire artillery of the Scindias. And if you read, you have read that book, and I have read that book by Randolph Cooper about the Second Anglo-Maratha War, which describes in great detail how the Maratha weapons and the Maratha cannons were superior to those of the East India Company. Lord Lake could defeat the Scindia armies in 1803 at whether it was at Delhi or whether it was Laswari or at Agra or at Aligarh, not because the Marathas were inferior as the weapons was concerned, but because the French commanders, by the proclamation of Lord Lake, that anybody who comes onto my side by the 30th of August 1803 will be allowed permission to take the ships back to Europe. And whatever the wealth the French mercenaries accumulated in India, there was only one way they could go back, and that was on English ships. So just on the anvil, when the battle was about to start, he invited the French commanders to defect. And suddenly you find the whole army, right from General Perron, who was the commander-in-chief of the Scindia armies and Daulat Ra's army. He was the first man to defect. And he was giving certificates to all the other officers that you can also leave and go. So suddenly you find that with good weaponry, but commanders who are leaving, there were some instances like at Aligarh and Agra, where the Maratha chiefs locked up their French commanders so that they don't defect. And they actually put them in prison in the fort so that they don't defect to the English. So that was the reason that they lost the battle to the East India Company in 1803.
Right. Well, I think that's something that we definitely look forward to in your next book or the book after that. So something that Dr. Kulkarni has mentioned on Twitter, and I'll mention it here. He is already planning his next 2 or 3 books to complete the 18th century Maratha history period. The next one is probably more well planned. I think it's going to focus on the Madhavrao era, like he has done in the earlier. It's a biography of Madhavrao Peshwa, but essentially cover the period from where this book ends to probably somewhere after the death of Madhavrao, or my guess is the first Anglo-Maratha war. But I won't give figuring out some of those details. But suffice to say, that will be an interesting book. And then, of course, the era after that is also equally fascinating, where Nana Fadnavis and Mahatji Shinde were again able to hold off against the British and again internal rivalry. But that's the last half of the 18th century. So there's a lot to look forward to in the year or two in terms of books. I'll wait for any last questions. Otherwise, I'm going to hand it over to you for any closing comments, and then over to Abhay for the closing comments.
Yeah, Dr. Kulkarni, I wanted to mention two things. One is, yeah, please.
I can't hear you.
Yeah, Abhay, go ahead. Abhay, we can't hear
okay. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
I can hear you. Yeah, I can.
Hello.
I can hear you now.
Yeah. Am I audible now?
Yeah. You are.
So, Dr. Kulkarni, I wanted to mention 2 points that you raised in the book. One is the idea of India emerged in Nanasaheb's era, where you have said that he could differentiate between the invaders from the northwest and the people who were within peninsular India. So, although there was a lot of infighting, he could differentiate that these are the outsiders and these are the people, these are our own people. So the idea of India really, which we kind of credit to the British, that it is they who really defined India and the idea of India. But this was much before that. This was something you attribute to Nanasaheb. Could you speak on that, please?
Not exactly Nanasaheb. It was Sadashivrao Bhau, whose letters are clearly mentioning that. But looking at world history also, if you see, India was not a political country, but it was a cultural union by itself. And I mean, the population was not such, or the communication was not so good that you could have a properly defined political boundaries at that stage, but it was a cultural union of various. And if you see in Europe also, it was the Holy Roman Empire till probably the middle of the 17th century, if I'm not mistaken. And it was a Treaty of Westphalia around that time which started creating nation states. And 100 years later, when Sadashivrao Bhau was marching north to face the invasion of Abdali, he very clearly writes letters, letters to the people he wanted as his allies, like Shuja-ud-Dawla and so on, that Abdalichi nerd yethe ruto dene ayogya. It is not right to allow Abdali to grow roots in this country. We would like the Chugtai dynasty to continue ruling over here. So having placed the Mughals under their protection, he was saying that I would like to continue the Mughals to rule in India, but I would not like Abdali, who he identified as an invader, because he came 5 times before that, invaded India and went back to Afghanistan. So that was very clearly defined that this is what we are fighting for is India, and whatever disputes we have amongst ourselves, we can settle later on. The first task we have before us is to face the invader, evict him, and then get back to resolving our own disputes. So he mentions that, and that is why I say that it was during his time that the idea of India was, that we find evidence for, I would rather say, it was defined. It could have been there before, but I have not found any evidence that the idea of India as a country was kind of defined.
Right. And then, of course, you begin with this quote about how the Marathas were an ulcer to the Mughals, and how Aurangzeb, almost the last 20 years of his life, he was kind of tired fighting the Marathas. And this was the period when the Mughal Empire really came apart and started declining. And Aurangzeb died in Ahmednagar, near Ahmednagar. Could you tell about this, about how the Marathas really played a key role here?
I mean, when Aurangzeb came down to the Deccan after the death of Shivaji, I think he came down in 1682. And he stayed here till he died 25 years later. This 25-year-old period, if you see, except for the 2 or 3 years that he spent in subjugating the kingdoms of Bijapur and Golconda, all the rest of the time was spent in fighting with the Marathas. In 1689, when he had captured Chhatrapati Sambhaji and put him to death, he thought that he has accomplished his task and he has captured destroyed the power of the Marathas, and he is now master of all of India. Unfortunately, the Maratha resistance continued. It no longer needed a king to guide their activities. Almost every chief who was at various places was fighting a battle for the Swarajya which was established by Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj. So that battle went on for 25 years. The Mughal armies, their generals, they were tired of the fight. They kept telling the emperor, let's go back to Delhi. But the emperor would not go back, and he continued fighting until at the age of 90 lunar years. He had not only exhausted the treasures of the empire, but the empire had become so weak, and while the Maratha momentum, because of this grassroots struggle which they waged for 25 years, had grown so powerful that when the Mughals started withdrawing after the death of Aurangzeb, it was the sheer momentum of the Marathas. In the last decade of the 17th century, you find the first incursions made into Malwa by Nemaji Sindhya. So from that time onwards, the path of the Marathas towards the north could not be stopped. 1707, Aurangzeb dies. 1719, you find the Marathas are in Delhi, along with Hussain Ali, who was the Subedar of the Deccan, with 30,000 troops. And they deposed the emperor at that point in time, who was Farrukh Siyar, and put a puppet emperor in his place. And they get the sanads of Swarajya and Sardesh Mukhi and Chauthai of the six Subhas of the Deccan. And they also get the release of Chhatrapati Sambhaji's queen, and even one of the wives of Chhatrapati Shivaji was still in prison that time. And so all these people were brought back to the Deccan at that point. So 12 years after Aurangzeb, you find, partly because the Mughals were kind of imploding, and partly because there was a vacuum created in the north, you could not be imagined in 1707 when Aurangzeb died in Ahmednagar, that 12 years from today, 30,000 Marathas would be in Delhi and changing emperors. So that's why it's said that the Spanish also ruined Napoleon, and the Deccan also ruined Aurangzeb or his empire.
Right.
So I think
Any comments from you, Amit?
Yeah, I think there are a few questions. I don't think we'll be able to take all of them. I'm just going to take one last question. All the time. One time we see the Maratha Empire expanding everywhere, subjugating so many different armies. Throughout the 18th century, we find that they were always in debts, and the debts just kept getting bigger and bigger. What was this issue about?
Part of the reason was that there was a war being fought every year, and the person defeated in the previous year had to be defeated again to get the Chauthai promised from him. Second reason was the money collected in the north did not necessarily reach the central treasury. In many ways, the buck stopped at the Peshwa's office. Chhatrapati Shahu depended on the Peshwa to take care of his debts, to take care of his expenses. The Peshwa had to depend on the chiefs who were spread all over, or on his own campaigns to get the money into the central treasury. But there were many regional treasuries at that time. And if the money didn't come, the expenses which had to be met by the central treasury, for which they had to take debts. At the time of Panipat, there are several letters you find. There are 4 Maratha armies in the field. There's one in Mysore facing Hyder Ali. There's one at Medak facing Nizam. The third one is at Panipat. And the fourth one is with Nanasaheb himself. Now, you can imagine the expense required to pay for these 4 armies which was there, and with money drying up, I mean, the constant invasions in the fighting in the north, even the merchants there were unable to pay their dues, even if they wanted to. They were taking money on loan for almost 1 to 2% per month at that time, which works out to almost 20%, 24% per annum, and a huge rate. You find that most of the Peshwas and their family members were married to daughters or sons of various Saukars, including Nanasaheb's last marriage. second marriage. He married Radhabai, whose father was a saukar in Python. So this was part of raising the money from various sources, and that money had to be raised because, as I said, the buck stopped there. He could not say that I don't have money. He had to raise it from somewhere.
Right. Now, I think, Abhay, we'll never run out of questions, but I think we should close given the time. I think some of these, I'll just add one point. Some of these questions, for those of you who are not on social media, I would urge to check out Twitter. Dr. Kulkarni is very active. His Twitter ID is at Mulamutha, MULAMUTHA, Mulamutha Rivers. And to try to reach him out there, he's also active on Facebook. He has a Facebook page, Solstice at Panipat, that's his page. He also has his personal page. So these are probably very good places to reach out to him. And you can buy this book on Amazon.in. It's available in India as well as in the US as well. Recently, it's been listed on Amazon.com as well for the US market. And for people in Pune, they can reach out to him directly to get a signed copy. I won't promise it, but I think he has worked out some logistics like people picking up the book from his clinic and things like that. So you can try that. So I think I'm done, Abhay. It's over to you to close.
Thank you, Amit. Thank you, Amit. Thank you, Dr. Kulkarni, for this wonderful session, for this wonderful conversation. Our understanding of the Peshwas has definitely increased and evoked a lot of curiosity, so much that we would really like to see what you've written and go through your book. Thank you very much for this session.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, sir. Before closing, I would like to mention that on Saturday, October 17th, External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar will be speaking at PIC at 5 p.m. on his new book, The India Way, Strategies for an Uncertain World. This will also be a conversation with Mr. Gautam Bambawale, former Indian ambassador to China, Pakistan, and Bhutan. So we will bring this event to a close. Do keep in touch with PIC. And finally, I thank our panelists, Dr. Kulkarni, Mr. Amit Paranjape, and the technical team at PIC for all the support that they've provided. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.